Professor Talbot. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this video recording for our students. Welcome.
No problem.
Thank you. So I'll jump right into it. One of the themes that we're interrogating this week in our course is to look closely at the role of the civil service. And one of the arguments that the students are being exposed to is that civil servants have to increasingly operate in a VUCA world, sort of an environment that's characterized by increasing volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, and complexity. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to these themes, focusing on the role of the civil service. Has that changed over time in responding to this VUCA world?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be careful, particularly with discussing in an international context. I know a lot of your students are not from Australia. Is discussing what we mean when we say civil service. I've come across some very big mistakes where, for example, people don't recognise that in Greece, the people who collect the refuse are civil servants, people who teach in schools are civil servants, whereas in this country they're not. In the United Kingdom, they're not civil servants. So we have to be careful about what we mean by civil service because it means very different things in different countries. So if we're talking about, if you like, the sort of traditional Whitehall model of the civil service, of that part of the public sector that deals directly with government and is the interface between the political leadership of the country and the administrative apparatus of the state, then that's very different from talking about even the civil service in the UK. The civil service in the UK, for example, is only about 1 in 10 of people who work in the public sector. And that's about, civil service is about 400,000, and only about 17,000 of them work in what we call policy profession. So work with policy, developing policy, interfacing with ministers, all of those sorts of things. So it's a tiny fraction of the overall public sector. So we need to be very careful what we're talking about when we use civil service. The second thing is, I think we need to always take a step back and look at this in historical perspective in terms of what's changed and what is likely to change in the future in different parts of the globe. If you take the G7 countries as an example, which is the leading industrial democracies, then what happened with them over the past 100 years is quite clear, which is the state expanded enormously. 100 years ago, in all of those countries, government was, if you took it in expenditure terms, about 10% of GDP. The average across those countries now is more like 40% of GDP. So it's a quadrupling of the size of government in terms of the amount of money it spends, and also the numbers of people it employs. The average, let me just check the actual number. If you go back to 2006, before the financial crisis, the average employment across the OECD was about 15% of the workforce worked for government in one form or another, public agencies, local government, federal government, and so on. So that's a massive change. One of the big questions for people is whether or not that change is also going to happen in developing and emerging economies. I mean, some of them obviously already have quite large public sectors and civil services, People's Republic of China being an obvious example. But some don't, and it's not clear at all yet, although it seems to be the case, that most emerging economies are moving in broadly the same direction about the size and shape of the state. And that affects a lot what it is that civil servants have to do. So if you take Britain now, the role of the civil service compared to 100 years ago is vastly different. 100 years ago, there was no health service, there was no real government-sponsored education service, there was no social protection. Those are now 3 massive areas of government activity. They're the 3, in expenditure terms, they're the 3 largest areas of activities across not just the G7, all the OECD countries, and that's been a huge expansion. So it means a large part of what they have to do focuses on what we broadly call welfare and social provision. And within that, there are some very big differences as well. So if you take education and health, in most cases, they're what Henry Mintzberg, the organizational theorist, calls professional bureaucracies, in the sense that they're run by large professional groups of doctors, teachers, nurses, paramedics, all of those sorts of people who drive the way the organizations operate. And managing them and directing them is a very different proposition from directing something that's a machine bureaucracy, like a tax collection agency or a benefits distribution agency. So within the civil service, what it does in terms of certainly in terms of managing the state apparatus, there are some very different roles involved in that. The traditional civil service role of interfacing directly with ministers is also quite complex and has been changing over time. I use four different roles that senior civil servants, certainly in Westminster systems, have to play. The first is that they act as counsellors to elected politicians in democracies, so even in not so democratic countries. They're the people who advise the leaders on what can be done and how what they want to achieve can be achieved through the state. So they give advice, they act as counsellors. In democracies, there's a second role, though, which conflicts with the first sometimes, which is what the American academic Larry Terry called the conservator role, which is that senior civil servants have to stick by the law. And sometimes that means saying no to ministers. No, you can't do that, minister. And that's a very difficult role for an unelected bureaucrat to be saying to a minister, no, you can't do that. But it's one that civil servants in those positions you have to do all the time, and there's all constant friction between elected politicians and permanent civil servants. And it's one of the reasons, of course, that some government systems have politically appointed senior civil servants, because that gets over some of those problems because they can order them about, although that then generates another set of problems. The third role is that they have to run certain services. And as I said right at the beginning, one of the interesting things is it's a bit of a historical accident which public services are run by the civil service and which are run independently or by state or local governments. So in the UK, prisons are run by the civil service, but schools aren't, hospitals aren't. Collection of most taxes is run by one central agency, but some taxes are collected through local government. Whereas for example, in Denmark, virtually all central taxes are actually collected by local government, does the administration. So they're very different models in different countries about how that works. The fourth role, going back to that point, that running the bits of the public service that are run by the civil service is, again, a very different role. And if you're the Director General of the Prison Service, you're a very different sort of civil servant from somebody who's advising ministers in the Home Office or the Department of Justice now. And the fourth one really relates to the fact that in very few countries is everything in the public sector in the civil service. Even where it is, senior civil servants have to play a big coordination role, that they're not just managing down in silos inside their own organisations. In most circumstances, and this has increasingly become the case, they're also having to manage laterally across a range of different organisations. And in a lot of cases, not just in the public sector, they're also coordinating with third sector and private sector organisations. We can see that at the moment really dramatically with the corona crisis here, where our Whitehall is having to coordinate with large private sector providers of food, to collaborate with private sector manufacturers of ventilation equipment, of drugs, and so on. So, and senior civil servants are having to manage all of those relationships. So it's become an increasingly difficult role.
Follow-up question though, because each of these four roles that you've outlined, the consular, the conservator, running agencies, as this coordination role. Each of these would require specific sets of capabilities,
Yeah.
which would be quite distinct to respond to the challenges that each of them face. Do you see an inherent tension in that?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things. One is there have been several attempts in different governments to try and separate out some of those roles. So we had a big initiative in the UK, for example, which started in the late 1980s, called the Next Steps program, which was to turn lots of what the civil service did into executive agencies with a chief executive, sort of modelled on a private sector company almost, with with clear aims and objectives set by the government as the sort of proxy shareholder for these organisations, and performance targets set for them, and having a chief executive who just went ahead with the implementation, and policy being decided in the parent departments in Whitehall. It never really worked. In some respects it did. It improved the management of some of the agencies, but that trying to separate out those two roles was extremely difficult, because if the parent department didn't have the knowledge of the operational side of how these organisations worked, something like the prison service, for example, then it was very difficult for them to set policy in the absence of knowledge about how they worked. And you end up with all sorts of tensions between the chief executives of the agencies and senior civil servants in the parent departments. In some countries, they've done that successfully. Sweden, for example, has long used that model, separating out those two roles. The federal government in the United States does that to a large extent, in the way in which federal agencies are run by a separate chief executive. But it takes, separating out the roles produces its own set of tensions. Certainly within the UK civil service, I think those roles are always in tension. There's always conflicts between them, and I don't think there's enough conscious discussion of those issues, of the tensions and the conflicts and the contradictions that are bound to come up because of those different roles, particularly the conflict between the conservator role of saying it's my job as a senior civil servant to obey the law and make sure that the institutions are protected, versus ministers who may be in a hurry to make changes and want to cut corners and not necessarily do things by the rules. And that can be a very difficult role to play.
There's another sort of follow-up related question, was basically this debate which you alluded to in your most recent blog post. You talked about the different forms of advice that is made available to government from the civil service, from ministerial advisors, from international agencies, for instance, as well as specialist advisors. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to this theme of how does the government reconcile these different forms of advice, as specifically with reference to the current pandemic, as we see different governments are responding to it, and the advice the continuous debate in Australia is, well, the best medical advice that the government has is not to shut down schools, for instance.
Right.
But is that a political decision and not necessarily one that is based on scientific evidence?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, people have to be more realistic and less naive about the way these processes work. I've given advice to governments and to large public sector organisations in the UK and various other places, including Australia. And when you're giving advice to governments, in private, you can speak truth unto power. Sometimes people don't even do that in private, to be honest. Some people know that ministers don't want to hear certain things, so they don't say it. But you're always in the process of negotiation to try and get the best outcome that you see as a professional, whether you're a civil servant or a scientific advisor or a medic or whatever. You're trying to get the best outcome through a process of negotiation with politicians who've got a whole set of other criteria to think about and pressures upon them. Take the example of shutting things down in the current crisis. No politician wants to be the person that goes on TV and says, we're closing all the schools, your children are going to be at home for the next few weeks, you're going to have to homeschool them. That probably means you can't go to work. It's not going to make you very popular. So you don't want to have to do that unless the scientific evidence is absolutely overwhelming. All of these things are a process of negotiation, and when it becomes public, scientific advisors, certainly government-appointed ones, are themselves civil servants, and they have to do what the government's decided to do and say what the government's decided to say. So when we see in this country, the chief medical officer or the chief scientific advisor getting up and talking on the television about what the advice is, you have to understand that that's the advice that's been negotiated and agreed. It's not necessarily their personal opinion about what the best thing to do is. That's the first thing. The second is, those people are usually, a relatively small number of people where the expertise, the pool of expertise on scientific issues or medical issues like this is much, much larger. And there are going to be controversies within those communities. So in the UK, for example, particularly when you've got something completely new like this coronavirus, we don't know all of its properties. We don't know what sort of epidemiological pattern it's going to follow yet. And the consequence is that there are different opinions amongst even the expert epidemiologists, never mind other people who look at these issues. So you're going to get conflicting advice going to ministers. There's a very good book which I would highly recommend called this one. It's called The Blunders of Our Governments by two of our most experienced observers of government, Anthony King and Ivor Crew. And they took 12 case studies over the last 30, 40 years in the UK where the governments have made massive mistakes. And I think the thing that came out of that most clearly was that the commonest factor across all 12 cases was a lack of openness and deliberation about what decisions were going to be taken, a degree of groupthink amongst the people involved. So even though they may come from different professional backgrounds and have different scientific and expert knowledge, they developed a group way of thinking about things which excluded other views and tended to denigrate other views as well. Anybody who raised objections was just trying to stop them doing what they wanted to do and trying to put obstacles in the way rather than raising genuine problems about why this might not work or why it wouldn't work in the way in which they wanted it to work. So there was a real problem about that sort of lack of deliberation, groupthink, small numbers of people not being open to challenge, and then once they've made the decision, being very determined to follow it through against all challenges. So even when people pointed out, this was going to be problematic, they didn't take any notice. I'll give you one small personal example of this. In 2011, the government, the then coalition government in the UK, published a document about implementing universal credit, which is a way of combining together about half a dozen or so major benefits which made sense in lots of ways and certainly seemed to be desirable. But I read the white paper they published outlining how they were going to do this, and I just said it's not going to work, certainly not in the timescale that they're talking about. And they were talking about having the entire thing up and running in 3 years. That was in 2011. It's still not fully up and running now in 2020. 9 years later, and they've had immense problems with it, most of which anybody who was familiar with implementing those sorts of large-scale system changes, which involved large IT changes as well, knew couldn't be done in the sort of timescales that they were talking about. But all of our criticisms from people outside of government were just ignored, that you're just trying to stop this happening, even though personally, I was saying, I think this sounds like a good idea. On principle, I'm not an expert on welfare benefits, but it certainly sounds to me like a sensible idea, but you can't do it in the way in which you're proposing to do it. Administratively, it's just not possible. And it was largely ignored. So it's that sort of closed mindset, resistance to criticism, lack of openness can be a really major problem. The other thing I think that's changing massively is that if you like, the ecology of knowledge is changing. It used to be the case that governments had a considerable monopoly over knowledge about what was happening in society. They were the people that ran the censuses. They're the people who collect the official statistics. They knew broadly what was happening in ways which no individual organisation, private sector organisation, could possibly do. I think the era of big data is beginning to change that. So there's lots of interesting examples now of where you can use data which is generated by private sector organisations to inform policy. To give you an example from a few years ago, there's some interesting work in the United States where they used data from pharmacies and supermarkets about sales of things like anti-inflammatories and so on, cold and flu remedies, to pinpoint outbreaks of cold and flu before any sort of medical evidence became available that it was happening, because they could see by an uptick of sales in a particular city or state that there was an outbreak taking place and people were going out and buying medicines to treat themselves, to self-medicate. But that information wasn't available to government in most cases because it was private commercial information available to the companies. The companies didn't want to share it because if they knew there was an outbreak taking place, they could gain competitive advantage by getting in extra stocks and being able to sell it when their competitors didn't know that there was an outbreak taking place, and so on. So you have a real problem then about the fact that there is this big data available. It's not all controlled by government, and how does government coordinate and access and use that sort of information effectively? And the coronavirus thing is showing us just how devastating it can be when they don't have that information, when they don't know about availability of food stocks or medicines, where the problems are. So I think that's changing the way in which governments have to think about what sort of data they can get access to, how they use it, how they can collaborate with particularly private sector competitive organisations that may want to hang on to the information for themselves. And that's something which governments are going to have to tackle in the future to make sure that they can access information, particularly critical information like what's going on at the moment with food supplies in the UK, for example.